a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, myself, yourself, and ourselves. Hello to him and her and they too. In today's show, the co-host is opening the banter with an experimental foray into the third person, in which she is showcasing what it feels like and sounds like to occupy a different point of view. She can't help but wonder what her co-host Grant Faulkner thinks of this style. Will he like it so much that forevermore the two co-hosts will make a mutual pact to abandon the I from their banter and their interviews, or will he beg her to come back to their tried and true conversation style? She decides there is only one way to find out. She asks the question, Grant, what is your impression of your co-host's narrative style today? And should she keep it up for the entire show, or should she come back to embody the I voice again? What do you think?
Grant actually loves this new style of talk because our society is much too me-focused. So he'd like to give it a whirl and refer to himself constantly as a character witnessed, not necessarily experienced. And it's kind of like Brooke and Grant had a spell cast on them, and they now no longer have an I, so they're doomed to a third-person life, or they're given a third-person life because that first person really did come with a lot of baggage. Except this is hard to do. And Grant Faulkner strangely misses himself, and I miss myself. So let's end this horrible spell and re-enter the troublesome I portal.
Ah, the troublesome I portal. Yeah, I could have kept that up, but it's actually kind of hard, interestingly. It was easier to write than to speak, let's say that. Obviously, that kind of style, Grant, I think, is much more compelling in the written word, because when spoken verbally like that, it's pretty awkward. And we're not used to hearing people speak about themselves in the third person, though sometimes politicians do, to my chagrin.
Sports figures, too. A lot of sports figures, too.
Figures. And rapists. Yeah, rapists? That's not the right word.
Rappers.
Rapists. Let's just linger on that for a minute. But when you do it as a literary device, it is, it does something to the brain of the reader, I think. It creates a certain distance between the reader and the narrator. And so for me, when I've read third person, I feel like I'm reading the story of the author, the narrator, but the distance is something that almost makes me feel like protected, insulated a little bit, like they're putting a layer between myself and them. And interestingly, like for Memoir, if there is something disturbing, perhaps an abuse scene is what's coming to mind, I can feel a little bit bubble wrapped in a way that I think is protective both ways. So I'm not always sure that's the intention of the writer, but that's how it's felt to me. So that's welcome sometimes, especially if I'm reading about a particularly hard experience.
That's interesting, Brooke. And I think the third person definitely changes the story for the reader and the writer. And I'm thinking about how Javier Zamora, who we had on the show, he told us about writing his story in the third person to separate himself from the trauma, and then he rewrote it in the first person. And that's an interesting exercise, because even with our short banter of shifting perspectives that we just experimented with, I felt I did feel my experience of the world shift a little bit. Suddenly I am a character witnessed by me as the author, rather than an individual agent in the world, who's perfectly matched with myself as an author. And so I guess the technique just highlights in some ways the fictionality of life, or just its many perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can say, I guess I don't know all the motives or why point of view in Memoir is shifting the way that it is, but I will say that this used to be a major no-no. Like, you were not supposed to go into the third person, decidedly. When I was at Seal Press, I remember doing a few books where authors ventured into second person, and I remember quite well that we had parameters around that. Like, yes, they were allowed to go into second person, but not for very long. And so an author could do a chapter, for instance, in second person, but not much more than that. I recall a book I worked on called Purge, and it was about recovering from an eating disorder. And the author was quite experimental. Like, she had done multiple chapters in second person. I really liked it. And there was like an editorial discussion about how much she could do of that without being annoying to her reader. So I think that's just so interesting to think about how far we've come, because now I feel like most memoirs are experimenting with the second person, and now what is becoming, like more encroaching, and that's maybe like you don't do your whole book, but you see some of it is this third person narrator, I dare say to the point of being almost common.
I'm curious, Brooke, if you have any cautionary tales here around this shifting point of view in memoir, because it seems to me that, it's wonderful that the rules are being, they're a little more fast and loose, and there are great things that come out of that, especially in the form of experimental writing and writers like Elizabeth Crane and Maggie Smith opening up, this genre in so many interesting ways. But there's also obvious downsides to it, like writers being a bit out of control with how they use point of view, or maybe not being in control of their narration, or even thinking those experiments that Elizabeth and Maggie did make it easier to write a memoir, when I actually think it's harder to do it that way.
100%. I agree with this because I see a lot of work from the students that I work with or submissions that I read. And these are writers that are maybe playing around, but they're not quite there with the mechanics. And in fact, a while ago, I wrote a Substack post called You in Memoir 5 Ways. And it was about implementing and understanding the various forms of you in memoir writing. I want to say I think that's an underappreciated post, Grant.
Everyone go out and read that, damn it.
Yeah, I hope that this interview will shine some light on it because, in all seriousness, it's something that's important because people don't really know how to use you in memoir. Like if you're using the second person and you're attempting to use the second person, great. But second person is only when you stands in for the writer, and it's obvious that the you in question is the writer, her or himself. And so, for instance, you cannot help yourself. You are veering once again into a point of view that is not first person. You want to try on this other lens. Why? Because you have things to teach your listeners. Because you appreciate narrative flexibility. Because you can. So in that little example, the listener does not think that I'm talking about them. It's a clear delineation of voice, right? It's me talking about myself in the second person, in the you. But inexperienced writers, they fling around like candy at a parade, this point of view stuff or you, and you can't do it that way. You got to be mindful. And so I'll just go through it real quick. The other forms of you I included in that post were universal writing, which I love, right? That's takeaway where the you is a stand-in for everyone. The second one was rhetorical you, which the reader feels because it's asking you to stand in a situation, basically. So for instance, let's imagine you're standing there minding your own business when all of a sudden someone rips your earbuds right out of your ears. You'd be incensed, right? That's the rhetorical you. And then there are two other similar ones, talking to the reader, which I do not like. And I can say more about that, but it just is kind of intrusive at times. And then there's talking to another person who occupies the space of you, which is what Kiese Lehman famously did in Heavy, where the you in question in his memoir is his mother. Ocean Vuong also does that in On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And so, these are beautiful and effective ways of using you, except for the you of talking to the reader. And so people need to understand that. And I think this is where you start to spiral out of control, is when people don't have like a very firm handle on what they're doing.
Yeah, I love that little mini lesson you gave, Brooke. And going to remind listeners, dear listeners, please go out and read Brooke's article to back this up.
Thank you. We'll put it in the show notes.
And now I'm wondering how I can break this third wall and talk to our listeners just to rile you up a bit, Brooke, since now I know that you find this annoying on the page. I can't figure it out, but thanks for indulging me, dear listeners. I'm actually now wondering if we live life, in shifting narrative perspectives. There's just so much to consider in all of that. And we will for sure put your post in the show notes, because I know you have great examples to share, and it's helpful for people who are working on their own material to back it up with an actual, reflective reading. But before we end here, though, I want to dig more into this question of why you don't like it when memoirs speak to the reader directly as you. I have a hunch why, but I want to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, it is just a pet peeve. So it's funny, like if we talk to our listeners on this show, that totally doesn't bother me, right? We sometimes say that like, hey, dear listeners, we're doing this and we're doing that. But in memoir, like I said earlier, I find it intrusive. Like I don't actually mind it in super small doses. I mean, people as famous as Mary Karr do this in limited ways. Mary Karr has a little thing for parenthetical asides, and sometimes she'll talk to the reader in those moments. But for me, it's like a wink to the reader that seems kind of too intimate on the one hand, and then often in the hands of less skilled writers, it can make the narrative sound like a diary entry. And I think that's the thing that I particularly object to. So it's kind of like, dear diary, do you know what I did today? I'm going to tell you, right? And then it's like the writer is like confiding to the reader in that way. And I personally find that unnecessary and sometimes jarring. Just tell the story. That's my soapbox.
Well, dear listener, please use this narrative technique with judicious moderation, because this writer agrees with Brooke that addressing readers and listeners directly can sound a little stiff and formal, like we're living in the Victorian era maybe. But that said, stay with us, dear listener. We will be back for more talk about point of view after this short break, which we know you'll enjoy. Well, Brooke, I'm always so pleased when we have a sponsor whose products and services I've actually used and enjoyed independently. And that's the case with Gotham Writers Workshop. I took my first class with them nearly 20 years ago, and it was an online class, my first online class ever. And I had my MFA at the time, and I have to say that my Gotham class was as good as any of my MFA classes. And in fact, the great writer Manuel Gonzalez taught it. But it wasn't just about Manuel. You know, all of the students in the course were super smart and really good writers. And amazingly enough, I'm still in touch with some of them. So I wholeheartedly recommend taking any of Gotham's courses.
I love that so much. And Gotham definitely has a high pedigree, and it's been around for a long time. They offer creative writing classes in New York City, but also over Zoom, and also asynchronous classes that you can take online. And so you can be anywhere in the world. And they have an amazing breadth of offerings, Grant. They offer memoir classes, woohoo, but also other nonfiction, as well as fiction, poetry, songwriting, and many others, and with super qualified instructors and for an affordable price.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, they are very much about community, so you can stay involved with Gotham in a number of ways, and they even put on conferences. And writers often ask me how to find a writing group or a beta reader, and I think taking a class is a great way to find good writing partner matches. So develop your craft and join a vibrant community of writers at Gotham Writers Workshop.
Yes, you can find them at gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting. Use our code, please, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply there, but definitely go check it out. And so endorse them, Grant.
Yeah. So one more time, visit gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting soon, and use the code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir and Nation with no space between them, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them that Grant sent you, and Brooke too.
Welcome back, everyone. We're so pleased to have Elizabeth Crane with us today. Elizabeth is the author of 4 collections of short stories, 2 novels, and 1 memoir. Her work has been translated into several languages and has been featured in numerous publications, including Other Voices, Nerve, Ecotone, Swink, Guernica, Coachella Review, and many, many other outlets. Her stories have been featured on NPR's Selected Shorts. She's the recipient of the Chicago Public Library 21st Century Award, and her work has been adapted for the stage by Chicago's Steppenwolf Theater Company. She teaches at UCR-Palm Desert's low-residency MFA program. She's joining us from New York, where she's recently recovering from having been sick. So, Elizabeth, we are so grateful that you're here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, my first pressing question is about point of view. Your memoir is called This Story Will Change. I devoured it. It was honestly the first memoir I've read that experimented quite as much as you do with shifting points of view, first, second, and third. And when I was coming up in memoir, it was actually kind of taboo for a long time to write in the third person, but now we're seeing a lot more of that. And so I wanted to just ask about your inspirations there and what led you to write so much of This Story Will Change in the third person.
Well, there's multi-parts to the answer. Really, I had no idea what I was doing. Sort of like the first
So
part
there's
of
that.
it.
Okay, good.
I wasn't planning on writing a memoir, and then my life fell apart. So I couldn't think about anything else. I wanted to write fiction. Couldn't focus on that. And I was just like, all right, I'm just going to scribble this story down and, maybe get it out of my system or something. And then it started to come out a little bit interesting. But the thing with the point of view is that I think in my efforts to try to write essay or nonfiction or memoir, specifically memoir in the past, I always really struggled to figure out how to put the creative in the nonfiction, because my fiction is so kind of, you could call it a lot of different things. I play a lot with form, point of view, reality, all that kind of stuff. And I just didn't think, I really had this idea that I wasn't allowed to do any of that in nonfiction. And I think that's been my experience too, that there was at one time a more kind of limited idea of what it was supposed to be. But I just felt like anything interesting that I brought to the table as a writer went out the window when I would try to write nonfiction, because I was like, first person or memoir, first person, straightforward storytelling. And, here's the thing. I don't experience my life in a straightforward way. I don't experience my life I only have one personality as far as I know, but like I do tend to write in a way that I think, which is, I think a lot of different things. I think I have a lot of, I have to go through a lot of thinking before I land on what I really do think,
Right.
And so it was a lot of throwing stuff at the wall. But honestly, too, I had started a lot of it in first person, and I was like, this feels a little boring. So I switched a lot of it into third or second, and, ultimately worked with an editor on what worked and what didn't.
It worked really well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
But we did think about like that in terms of like some of the ones in first person, the hope is that those ones are maybe more impactful, or, moments that were more challenging or painful or whatever. But really it was a lot of throwing spaghetti at the wall.
Elizabeth, I love this, releasing this vice grip on the eye of memoir writing. I just love the way you've expanded this notion of storytelling for memoir, and it's so freeing and different and fun. But I'm imagining it also maybe has some pitfalls, and so I was wondering if you can speak to any you found as you work to, write a memoir with a lot of variation on point of view. Did it get confusing at any time, or?
Oh, I've never written a book that wasn't confusing. I confuse myself constantly.
It's your aesthetic.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't that way. I write things out of order. But the one thing that helped me in this particular project is that I really, because I'm not confident in memoir, or wasn't at least when I started it, who knows what'll happen yet, but I wasn't really worried about anybody reading it, because I was just like, I'm just trying to get rid of this right now, And as it started to turn out better, then that sort of shifted a little bit. But really, I just tried to trust my instincts as a blanket writer of whatever, and hope that it applied.
Sometimes I think we forget to tell writers to trust their instincts.
Yeah, well, sometimes you have to, I'm a teacher. Sometimes you have to say, like, your instincts are not right. So I'm trying to give you some new ones.
It's true. It's true.
Both can be true.
I appreciate what you're saying, though, because it's kind of freeing. Part of me thought I might come on here and you're going to be like, oh, I have all of this wisdom and here's what I think about point of view, And so I think that just sort of like experimentation aspect of it is very freeing for authors, because I'm working with someone right now who's doing a third person memoir, and I'm finding it really compelling. So,
oh, cool. Glad to hear it.
Yeah, it's been fun. And, I have to confess that I came to your work after I read Maggie Smith's You Could Make This Place Beautiful. And the reason was because I was talking to Gina Frangello about the success of Maggie's book and what she liked and what she didn't like. And she kind of offhandedly was like, oh, well, Elizabeth Crane did that before Maggie did it. And then I was like very curious, and what she was referring to, I think, is this experimental style. And Maggie got a ton of attention for that. And I'm wondering, how you would react to that comment, and whether you would see similarities between your story and hers.
Sure. I could probably go on too much about it, but she had, she read it. She read my book for me. She blurbed my book. But I also believe in like a zeitgeisty kind of thing, that happens. It's happened to me before. Actually, very early in my career, like there was like a weird overlap between my work and someone else's, and neither of us had read the other person's work. When you get into like sort of similar subject matter plus like slightly overlapping in style, it's a thing that does happen,
I think there's also something about the real influence, like if she was influenced, if she saw in your story something that would help her, break something, I also think that's quite generous in and of itself and I'm curious if you feel the same way, that people might be influenced by your work and do what they do.
I mean, I don't know. I hope if they do, I hope it's a good thing. I have been influenced by so many people, I've been influenced by so many people in my fiction career anyway. And that is how I ultimately approached the memoir. But I mean, like, I think about, and I think everybody does this, but like, I know that certain writers I was reading as my fiction improved, honestly, the writers that I was beginning to read gave me license to write like myself. And I was just like, oh,
yeah.
One of those people famously was at the time David Foster Wallace. And so I was like using footnotes and things like this. And people noticed, nobody said I was ripping him off, but like, it was mentioned more than a few times. I don't think anybody's ever going to accuse me and him, and probably not me and Maggie Smith. I'm also not a poet.
But you are a fiction writer, and we want to acknowledge that. Short story writer and a novelist. And so even though you're finding yourself on a show called Memoir Nation, and we definitely want to talk more about your memoir, I'm also curious about your path to and from memoir to fiction, since I'm doing this myself. And how did this memoir call you? And was there ever a point where the story of This Story Will Change was going to be fiction?
Well, that's also a good question. I mean, yes, editors specifically proposed that. I think once I decided, like, okay, the writing here is okay, but once editors came into the picture, that's where the fiction question really came in. And there was one of the people on the editorial, group that was like very adamantly like tried to pressure me to call it a novel. By that point, I thought about it, and it was primarily a marketing decision, or like money as often as going to be. By that point, I had worked so hard to write a truthful story. I didn't make stuff up. Some of my fiction is autobiographical, but even I veer wildly off course in my fiction when I use autobiography. And so I made a very deliberate choice here. If I was going to use a storytelling device, that it would be very clear to the reader, like, this is going on in my head, But basically it's, it was like, okay, this is my point of view on how I experienced this relationship and these ensuing moments to the best of my ability. And so that landed in memoir to me. And I felt really proud of myself for doing something new, And so I wanted to call it what I believed that it was. That may or may not have been the right decision, but I'm really glad that I did,
Yeah, plus it's exciting to be a multi-genre author and then just be able to see the ins and outs and the differences.
It is.
You teach in an MFA program, so you're exposed to students in all different kinds of ways. And I'm curious how that informs your writing. I mean, I said at the beginning, like I was just imagining, the insight and wisdom of a teacher, but I love also the intuitive aspects of it. But I saw your memoir as being actually quite risking in the best kind of way. And
Thank
I was
you.
yeah, of course. And I was wondering if being a teacher informed that risk taking, and if you're the kind of teacher who encourages your students to take risks with form and point of view and voice.
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. And, one of the things that, like, one of the best ways I can try to do that for people is just through making reading suggestions that because that's the way it happened for me. And so I have long reading lists, but I also like really try to tailor specific reading to a student once I know their style and what they're trying to do, things that might crack them in the way other authors have cracked me as a writer.
Elizabeth, every time I try to expand form or experiment with form, as you've done, I categorically get pushback somewhere along the way. And so I'm just curious if you got pushback or did you just worry about how it would be received?
I did. You mean when I was starting?
I think at any point, really. I think when you do something against the grain of expectations, you always have somebody saying like, well, no one's going to understand this. They won't follow it or they won't buy it, all that.
That has been the story of my career.
Oh, good. Mine too.
I honestly think that like, it's like I think my stuff is really readable. I really do. I think it's risky, but it's very readable. Like I'm not out here trying to like reinterpret like, the classics or anything like that. I'm just trying to tell you stories. I'd like to make people laugh a little bit. I try to say something true, but I think back to like an early workshop that I had where I was writing, I think it was before I'd published anything. And, there was one of the stories was it was one sentence. It was one entire run-on sentence for like 8 pages. And somebody was like, you can't do that. You just can't do that. And there more of the people in the workshop, like were baffled by my work than any other. And 2 of them were like, don't change a word.
What wonderful 2 people they were. I was going to say I've done the same thing, but I love the idea of a one-sentence story that goes for 8 pages. There's so many different textures you can explore that way,
And that story, of course, went on to be published. And I remember meeting someone one time and introduced myself, and I was like, oh, I know who you are. You're the one who wrote that story with all the exclamation points. I was like, oh, yep, well, that's me. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I wanted to ask you about publishing. Your publisher on the memoir is Counterpoint, and that's a publisher I know well because they're Berkeley based, and it's kind of a small world out here in Bay Area publishing. I was curious if you could share your insights about getting Memoir published right now. I think that so many people who listen to our show feel discouraged about the prospects of getting traditionally published. Counterpoint is one of those indie presses that's taking a lot of risks, particularly with Memoir. But what's the story there, and how did you land at Counterpoint?
I had known my editor at Counterpoint for some time, and I published 2 books with them. And the previous one was a book of shorts, also very weird short stories. And so they were the first place I went with the memoir. So I didn't get a sense of what the atmosphere was like out there. But you hear things through the grapevine or whatever about what sells, what doesn't sell. I've never felt like I could really get a grip on it because it's always seemed to me like, certainly maybe in the big 5 houses, like there's this idea like that they want to make money. And fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. But the what little I understand about how finance works, like, rather than throwing all the money at this one thing that you think is a really good bet, even if it's a fantastic book, you could maybe distribute that a little bit better and put some of that toward these riskier books that are maybe just as good. And they would have a better chance. So, like I don't fault the form, itself. I want to live in a world where I believe that like there's always room for good work. I know it's not easy, but I just have to hold on to that idea that that good work can find a home. I think it certainly can take effort, and you do maybe need to be willing to sort of explore different avenues for that. But I always say my glass is like 51% full.
No, 51% is great. 1 percentage over into optimism.
Exactly.
I love it. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's really a thrill to have you on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Elizabeth, you've inspired me to go back to pushing the boundaries.
Excellent.
We'll be right back with today's book trend. Well, Grant, because we ended today's show or interview talking about Counterpoint Press, one of our beloved small indies, I wanted to talk a little bit about getting Memoir traditionally published. And I think I've mentioned on this show before that I run with Piper Kerman, who's the author of Orange is the New Black. She's my running buddy. And I'm lucky because we get to talk about memoir a lot, or we just do. And she has her finger on the pulse of things that trend a little more commercial and a little more traditional than me. But the other morning, she announced to me that New Press was no longer acquiring Memoir. And that got me thinking about whether that's a trend, because she's not the first person to tell me that this or that publisher is no longer publishing Memoir. And so I decided to look into it. And guess what? I found an amazing resource. I sent it to you to look at. So what do you think?
Oh my God, that is so impressive, that list. And it's so comprehensive. I love lists like this, they're dream lists. And we'll definitely put the link into show notes. But it seems that the list was compiled by a guy named Becker, who runs Jones Editing Services. And he specializes in fiction, but he also offers memoir editing services. So, like I said, when people create these kinds of lists, I'm always just so impressed by their generosity, because it takes a lot of effort to compile something like this. And it actually has 136 publishers, and I get asked this all the time of where should you submit? So if you get a list like this, it's just such a gift.
I totally agree. And it was interesting. Like we said, we're going to put the link in the URL for folks, but Counterpoint is not on the list. So they must only accept agented manuscripts, and or it's possible this is not totally comprehensive. But what impresses me about this is that there are so many presses I've never heard of. And I do always encourage otherwise discouraged writers to cast their nets wide, because if you want to give it a go in the traditional market, you should, and yeah, a lot of rejection is involved, and therefore a lot of perseverance is required. But I guess this trend is sort of efforting to disprove the bubbling idea of the other trend that, traditional publishers aren't acquiring memoir anymore. And I have heard that a lot, but I'm also heartened to see all these small presses that are actively looking for memoir. And Grant, maybe we can reach out to Becker and ask if we could share or recreate this resource for Memoir Nation. I just think it's an important resource, and authors often feel that, they don't have what they need, or they don't know where to go. And this is the kind of thing that gives them their best chance to, get out there with their work.
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to point out about this list, though, is the word unsolicited, which can be a tricky word. I don't want to assume that all of our listeners understand what it means that a press is accepting unsolicited manuscripts. So, Brooke, can you share a bit more about this process and what writers who have finished a manuscript would need to do if they wanted to submit to one of these publishers, unsolicited?
Absolutely. I think the most important thing about unsolicited, it just means that you are unagented. And so you are knocking on the door of a publisher without having an agent. Therefore, it is unsolicited. It does not mean unwanted. It just means unsolicited. And you want to then approach that process as if you were querying an agent. I do want to remind people, and maybe you don't even know this yet, maybe you do, but you don't want to try to shop to agents and editors at the same time. So usually people will send their manuscripts out to presses in this unsolicited way after they have tried and failed to get an agent, or because they're going straight to publishing houses without trying to go the agented route. So that's really all it means. So you always want to put your best foot forward. You want to look at their submissions guidelines and make sure you're following them. You want to have a really strong query letter, and you want to make sure your manuscript is edited and clean and ready to go.
Yeah, I've actually sent out unsolicited manuscripts to small presses many times. And I just want to emphasize that it can take as much or more patience and resilience to get published with them as well. And that's because they have small staffs and who are often overwhelmed with submissions. So I've submitted novels and never heard back, and that's not uncommon. It's why actually a lot of authors will enter. Like sometimes these small publishers have contests, and authors enter the contest just to know that they're being read. And I also think it's a way for those small publishers to kind of make money or break even with their submission acceptance process. And that's actually one of the reasons I go to conferences like the AWP conference every year, so I can meet editors, so they can put a name to a face. And then I keep those relationships. I'm in contact with all of my small press publishers, and even talking to them about future projects of some sort. But the good thing is, it's just good to know that there's so many options, so many different pathways for your book. And I want to thank listeners for listening and writing. And I also want to invite you all to leave comments on our Spotify channel. We get notifications when there's a comment, and we try to reply to them all. So that's just one more great aspect of this memoir writing community and being able to keep the conversation going. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.